All right, there we go. So the first two, fusiform and parallel. Fusiform, the bicep is a good example of that, biceps brachii. It's essentially just, there's a lot of weight in the middle. So it's thickened in the middle and then kind of tapers off. These white pieces are tendons. So the pinkish color is the actual muscle cell, and then the tendons are what's connecting it to the bone. Okay. I'm having issues. And then parallel muscles are just like they sound. All of the cells, the fascicles, are oriented parallel to each other. So in one long line, and then they have tendons kind of holding them together like little belts. Triangular muscles have fascicles oriented like a triangle, pretty straightforward. So broad at one end, and then it tapers down to the tendon at the other end. So the pectoralis major is a good example of that. One of your main thoracic muscles in your chest. And then you have circular muscles, which are also called sphincters, which are going to form circles around body openings. So the orbicularis oris, which is the muscle around your eye that allows you to blink, basically is a circular muscle, and the fascicles are oriented basically in a circle, and they'll connect to the tendon at one end. And then we have pennate muscles. There's actually 3 subcategories of pennate muscles. Pennate just means feather shaped. So unipennate, you have kind of, it's almost like half a feather. So this tendon here would be like the vein in the middle of the feather. And there's fascicles coming off of just one side. So uni means one, unipennate. Bipennate, obviously fascicles coming off of both sides of that tendon. So that looks like a typical feather. So bipennate here, you have fascicles coming off both sides of that tendon. And multipennate is basically a whole bunch of feathers stuck together. So multipennate, you have multiple tendons with fascicles coming off of either side of each of those tendons. So here you have kind of one piece, one feather, another feather, etc., with the tendon running down the middle of each. So just know generally those shapes and kind of descriptions of the shapes, and then the examples that are given here. Don't worry about palmar interosseous. I won't ask you about that, but just know the examples that are under each of those fascicle orientations, and that's really all you need to know for the fascicle stuff. Okay. Into something that's a little bit more understandable or applicable maybe. There's 4 different functional groups of muscles depending on what they do, and it can kind of change depending on what the movement is that you're talking about. So the first 2 are the agonist and the synergist. So the agonist is the prime mover. It's the muscle that's doing most of whatever motion you're talking about. So if you're flexing your arm or flexing your elbow, the biceps brachii is doing most of that. That would be the agonist or the prime mover. A synergist is just a muscle that's helping the prime mover. So the brachialis would be a good example. If we're using the example of flexing your arm, the brachialis is underneath the biceps brachii, and it's kind of helping, but it's not doing most of the work. And I'll show you this on a diagram, not the next slide, but the slide after, and give you these examples of muscles. So synergist is just helping that prime mover. And then you have the antagonist, which opposes the prime mover. So why do we have a muscle that's opposing the movement that we want to happen? Basically just to help stabilize the joint. So it prevents any excessive movement. So if you're flexing your arm, the antagonist, which is doing the opposite motion, would be on the back of your arm, your triceps brachii. And then finally, you have fixator muscles that will also kind of help stabilize and prevent movement of the bone. So it will, these will stabilize one part of the body while another part of the body is moving. So I don't have an example of a fixator on the next slide. I have all the other three using the arm as an example on the next slide. But the fixator example for you to kind of relate something to is that when you're moving your hip or your knee, say you're lifting your leg up, you're using your abdominals to keep your body upright. If you didn't have your abdominals actually keeping your body upright and you tried to lift your leg, you'd kind of fall over because of that force. So your abdominals are really important fixator muscles. A lot of trunk muscles are important fixator muscles because they help just stabilize during different movements of the body. Okay, so those are the 4 functional groups of muscles. Here is a diagram with the examples kind of pointed out, so you have something to relate those terms to. So if we're talking about, like I said, flexing the elbow, bringing the forearm up, the biceps brachii and the brachialis are both synergistic. They're both working together. Biceps brachii is probably going to be the prime mover, the agonist. And then you have the antagonist on the backside with the triceps brachii essentially doing the opposite. So that's kind of a big picture view of how different muscles work together. Just because you're flexing one muscle doesn't mean the other muscles aren't doing anything. There's a lot of muscles actually working together to make any one movement happen. Okay, now these next couple slides are just sort of to help you remember muscle names. If they're helpful to you, excellent. If not, you can ignore them. Don't just ignore them because they're extra information, but they can really help you, like I mentioned on Monday, sort of break down the name of a muscle, considering muscle names are so highly Latinized and they don't really make a lot of sense in our modern English language. So breaking down the Latin meanings can help you learn a bunch of muscles kind of all at one time, or at least know maybe where they are in the body or generally what they do, or what parts of the body they work on. So muscle names can be based on a lot of different things that I've listed up there. You don't have to memorize all those things, but this is where these terms may come from any of those different characteristics of the muscle, the shape, the size, the direction of the muscle fibers, etc. So here's a couple of examples of how you can kind of break down a muscle name. And I did this on Monday, I think, for a couple to get an idea of what it is. Even if you have no idea what the abductor digiti minimi is, you can kind of break down those 3 words and figure out generally what it might do. And since the exams that I give are pretty much all multiple choice, it'll hopefully help you maybe cross out at least 1 or 2 answers and get you closer to the right answer. So you know what abduction and adduction is. So abduction is moving something away from the midline, assuming you do remember abduction and adduction, that's the first step. Adduction is moving towards the midline. Digiti is obviously referring to a digit, a finger or a toe. And then minimi just means small. So this is, if you go all the way over the translation here, a muscle that is moving the little finger or toe away. So you can start, you can look up what all of these, if you keep seeing certain terms over and over again, like levator is one that pops up a few times. If you learn what levator means and you kind of know what that action is, it elevates something. Like the levator scapulae is going to elevate the scapula, so it'll bring the scapula up. Use that for what it's worth. In your textbook, there should be more detail on some of these Latin roots, so you can look into those if that's helpful for you. And then here, I think this is from it's either your textbook or your lab manual. I can't remember which it's from. But here's a few mnemonic devices, so just kind of helpful little ways to remember some of these Latin roots. So for example, again, you don't need to memorize this. If this helps you, say you see longissimus over and over again, there is one muscle in the erector spinae group that's named longissimus. That just means the longest. The way to remember longissimus is longer than longus is that the word is actually longer, right? So looking at each of these, so here for you guys on Zoom, I was pointing out longissimus means longest. The way to remember that is obviously that longissimus is longer than the word long. So there's a few of these kind of throughout here that might be helpful to you that you see over and over. Again, for words that you see, your roots that you see over and over again, those might be the most helpful ones to kind of focus on and figure out what they mean, because then you can apply that to a bunch of different muscles. All right. But like I said, you don't have to memorize these. This is really just for your benefit if it's helpful for you. I find it really helpful, but that doesn't mean everyone does. Okay, the muscular system. I mentioned this on Monday, I think. As you're looking at the diagrams in your textbook and your lab manual, so we'll be doing muscles next week in lab, you will see diagrams often split into two. So you'll have, so muscles are layered on top of each other, right? Which makes muscles a lot harder to learn, I think, than bones, because bones aren't layered on top of each other. Now you have superficial muscles go all the way down into deep muscles. So a lot of these diagrams are going to be half superficial muscles. So this guy here on his right side, these will be the superficial muscles. On his left side, the superficial muscles are cut away and you're seeing the deeper muscles. I just wanted to point that out so when you're looking at these diagrams, you know if you're looking at superficial or deep muscles. That can help you, and you'll need that for when you're actually identifying muscles. If that is a consideration for a question on the exam, I'll let you know and be very clear as to whether muscles have been cut away and you're looking at deeper muscles versus more superficial. Now I want to talk about just basically two different areas of the body, really focusing on the trunk. So mostly just one area of the body that is particularly tough to learn the muscles because it's a little bit more complicated and there are many layers. So I'm going to start with the trunk and then I'll talk briefly about the rotator cuff in particular. Other than that, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the specific muscles. You have the muscle list and you know kind of what you need to learn from that. Muscles of respiration, I want to go into detail on because breathing is pretty important and it's a little bit more complicated than we probably give it credit for. So we'll talk about what muscles are involved in respiration. I'll go into a little bit of detail about the anterior abdominal wall, and then trunk muscles also deal with movement of the vertebral column. I'm not going to go into that, but those are the erector spinae muscles. So there's 3 of those that you need to know. But I'm going to focus on these first 2 bullet points here for the next few minutes. Okay, breathing requires a number of different muscles, basically kind of 3 sets of muscles in your thoracic cavity. So the diaphragm, has everyone heard of the diaphragm muscle? That's the one we usually think of when we think of breathing. The diaphragm is really important, but we also have these intercostal muscles. Intercostal means in between the ribs. So these are found basically kind of connecting the ribs. There's external and internal. And I'll talk about what each of those kind of does in the process of taking a breath in and expelling a breath. Two terms you want to know dealing with breathing. Air intake is called inspiration. When you expel air and breathe out, that is expiration. Inspiration and expiration. So we're going to talk about the process, what happens to these muscles when you breathe in versus when you breathe out. First, the diaphragm. In this cadaver photo over here, the diaphragm is this purple highlighted muscle. You can see the lungs here. This dead person's diaphragm is relaxed. He or she is not breathing in. The lungs are not full. So when your lungs are not full, your diaphragm is relaxed and it's kind of dome shaped. So you can think of it as pushing the air out of the lungs. When it's dome shaped, it can push the air out of the lungs. When you breathe in, it flattens. That's a contraction. So your diaphragm contracts when you breathe in. The lungs are expanding, the diaphragm gets pushed down. When you breathe out, the diaphragm domes up again and helps push air out of the lungs. So that is the relaxation portion of that muscle. So you want to be able to tell me whether if you breathe in, is your diaphragm contracted or relaxed? And then same with breathing out. So when your lungs are full versus empty, know whether the diaphragm is contracted and flat or relaxed and dome shaped. All right, that's the diaphragm. And we also have those intercostals. The external and internal intercostals are going to do sort of the opposite action. The external intercostals are kind of on the outside of the ribs. They're going to essentially elevate the ribs and expand the thoracic cavity. So that's when you're breathing in. So when you're breathing in, your diaphragm is flattening and contracting, and your external intercostals are contracting and kind of expanding your rib cage to allow for more room for your lungs. This also creates sort of a vacuum within your lungs to allow air to flow in more efficiently. Those are the externals. The internals essentially do the opposite. They're going to depress and retract your ribs and help expel air. So externals are involved in inspiration. It's kind of backwards sounding, isn't it? The external intercostals breathe in, inspiration. Internal intercostals expel air. So sort of the opposite of those beginnings of the words, at least. Internal or external inspiration, internal expiration. All right, and that is all I want you to know as far as muscles go about respiration. Those three groups of muscles. And then the anterior abdominal wall. So I'm not talking about the back at all, just the front, the typical abs that we kind of think about. So transverse abdominal was one of the questions on Jeopardy that I think we got to. So those are the deepest. These are basically 3 layers of abdominals on the front side of a person's body. You have the external, internal, and transverse. That goes from superficial to mid-level to deep. The obliques, so external abdominal oblique, just means they're on the side, basically, of the abdominal cavity. So lateral, yeah. Lateral abdominal muscles. So external, and I'll show you on the next slide, a diagram where they're kind of cut away, and you can see this. So external, then internal, then transverse are the deep, deep ones. Okay, so here is a good view of these really four different layers when we take into account the rectus abdominis, which I'll talk about on the next slide. So you have here the rectus abdominis, they're cut away so you can see into that abdominal cavity. Here you have that most superficial layer of the three I was talking about, the external abdominal obliques. Then you have the internal abdominal obliques, and then the transverse abdominals, which sometimes are called transversus. So for you guys on Zoom, where's my mouse? So here you have external, and then one layer down, internal, and then the transverse all the way down, with the rectus abdominis on top of all of that. So the rectus abdominis, I think we got to this in Jeopardy as well. These are the six-pack muscles of the abs right in the middle, down the midline. Sorry, it's one muscle. I always think of it as multiple muscles. It's one muscle that's divided by three transverse tendons. So these three tendons that run across the body. And then there's one really important tendon that you need to know running down the midline longitudinally. That's the linea alba. So that's on your list of muscles that you need to know. It's not a muscle. It's a tendon that separates the right and left sides of the rectus abdominis. Okay, and I think that wraps up the abdominal muscles that I wanted to talk about. Yeah. So now I just wanted to really quickly touch on those rotator cuff muscles because they're easy to get confused and sort of difficult to remember what they are and then where they're located around the shoulder. So these are the four muscles that essentially hold your arm into the glenoid cavity of your scapula. So it's holding your arm on. The acronym to remember these is SITS, S-I-T-S. So you have the supraspinatus and infraspinatus, teres minor, and subscapularis. Those are the four muscles of the rotator cuff. Supra means on top of, infra means underneath. So we have supraspinatus, and then infraspinatus is, like kind of on the back here. So you have supraspinatus and infraspinatus, sort of really close to each other here. And teres minor, there is a teres major that you need to know. It's not part of the rotator cuff. The teres minor is on the back side of the scapula. So teres minor is here. Subscapularis, that means under the scapula. So subscapularis, if you peeled off somebody's scapula, it would be right underneath there. So here you have subscapularis, underneath the scapula. Okay, so you want to know those four names and then be able to identify them on a diagram like that. I wouldn't ask you to identify them on, say, a cadaver photo because they're hard to tell apart. So these will be on a diagram. Okay, that wraps up the muscular system. No, it doesn't. I forgot about carpal tunnel, sorry. False alarm. We're almost done. This is the last part I have to talk about with the muscular system because carpal tunnel syndrome is a very prevalent issue, especially as we sit at our computers more and just do the repetitive motion of typing, or if you're on your phone all the time, doing the repetitive motion of scrolling, basically. Carpal tunnel is very prominent, especially in very kind of rich countries that have a lot of accessibility to computers and other electronics. Okay, I think everyone's probably heard of carpal tunnel syndrome. Has everyone at least heard that term? It deals with the wrist, and it's basically pain caused by a nerve being pressed on in the wrist. A little bit of anatomical background here. Around the wrist, you have something called a flexor retinaculum, which is just a fibrous connective tissue sheath, essentially, that crosses over the wrist. The carpal tunnel, so carpal, you know, are the wrist bones. The carpal tunnel basically runs underneath that fibrous sheet between the bone and the flexor retinaculum. There's nerves that go in there, there's muscles that run through there, and it's a really narrow space. So what is carpal tunnel syndrome? It's essentially when a nerve gets irritated in the wrist, in that carpal tunnel, due to repetitive motion, the same motions basically over and over again. And it causes inflammation in the area. That swelling essentially puts pressure on what's known as the median nerve of the wrist. We haven't gotten into nerves yet, but there's a wrist nerve called the median nerve that runs all the way from your central nervous system, your spinal cord, out into your hand. And it has to pass through that really narrow carpal tunnel. So if there's any inflammation or swelling, that puts pressure on the nerve and causes pain. It can cause tingling in the palm or maybe out in the tips of the fingers. It can cause muscular weakness in the palm. And it can also lead to essentially radiating pain from the wrist area up into the shoulder, up the arm and into the shoulder, because that nerve runs the length of your arm. So depending on how bad it is, it might just be tingling in the fingers, or it could be kind of more widespread pain. There's a number of treatments, again, depending on how severe it is. Anti-inflammatory drugs can work. They can decrease the inflammation and the swelling in the wrist area, which will take pressure off the nerve. Immobilization of the wrist, just to prevent that repetitive motion that's basically causing that inflammation. So like a brace on your wrist can help. And in really extreme cases, surgery might come into play to remove that fibrous sheath that's essentially creating this really narrow area for that, basically creating the carpal tunnel to relieve the pressure on that nerve. So part of that flexor retinaculum can be removed, or all of it, depending on how bad the situation is. Okay, and that's it. Yay. So that wraps up the muscular system information. I have somebody, I don't know if it was here or the 8 a.m. class, mentioned the crash course video series. Have you guys heard of that on YouTube? It's really helpful. So the guy talks really fast sometimes, but there's a lot of really good information. So the muscular tissue stuff where we're dealing with like the muscle contraction is, I think, one of the harder parts of this unit. And there is a video on that through the crash course series. I put a link to it in Canvas, so you guys can go back and look at it under modules. For you guys on Zoom, I should probably show you where I'm going. So I put it in a couple different places under links, and then at the bottom here of this module. So crash course video, muscle tissue. So like I said, the guy talks really fast. So we're gonna watch this just as kind of a review. The more times you see this information, the myosin and actin binding, the calcium being released, all of those really detailed steps, the more likely it will sink in. He talks fast. It's packed full of information. He basically goes over what took me probably an entire 50-minute class period to talk about in like 10 minutes. So the idea is I'm going to show it to you. Don't get overwhelmed. Hopefully you recognize most of the steps, and then you can go back to it and pause it, take notes, kind of let everything sink in. There is a video on, gosh, there's a whole AMP series in Crash Course. He does a lot of other topics as well, but there's a lot of really helpful videos that he does.
Paris, Tristan and Isolde. These famous star-crossed lovers bring to mind insatiable longing, forbidden love, and tragic separation, and poets and emo rockers love them for it. But you know where else you can find a nice hot romance? Your muscle cells. They've got their own famous coupling, a pretty pair of tiny protein strands called actin and myosin. Romeo and Juliet may have set a chain of tragic events into motion with their infatuation, but deep down in the cells of your muscles, the hot protein action between actin and myosin is actually literally causing all of your motions, all of them. And I don't just mean voluntary stuff like walking down the street or moving your mouth so you can talk or chew chips, because your muscles also support your weight and help fend off gravity. The amazing thing about your complicated, self-healing, blood-guzzling muscle tissues is that they turn chemical potential energy into mechanical energy or movement simply by doing two things: contracting and relaxing. And that contracting and relaxing is exactly what's fueled by the constant coupling and separation of biology's greatest lovers. Somebody get these proteins a movie contract. You will recall from our early lessons on tissues that you're kept alive and moving by three types of muscle tissue: smooth, cardiac, and skeletal. Your smooth muscle tissue is found in the walls of all your hollow visceral organs like your stomach and airways and blood vessels, where it involuntarily and very usefully pushes fluid and other material around by contracting and relaxing over and over. Your heart is so important that it gets its very own muscle tissue type, cardiac muscle, which looks striped or striated and also functions involuntarily to keep your blood pumping without you having to think about it. So when you hear the word muscle, you're probably thinking of the kind that you see on Chris Evans when he first walks out of that machine in Captain America. And those types, the ones you can see and feel and flex, are your 640 skeletal muscles. They're striated like cardiac muscle tissue, but they're also mostly voluntary, meaning you have to think about using them and activate them with your somatic nervous system. Most of them attach to your skeleton and create movement by pulling bones in different directions as they contract. Each one of your different skeletal muscles, like your biceps brachii or vastus lateralis or gluteus maximus, is technically its own organ made up mostly of muscle tissue, but also of connective tissue, blood vessels, and nerve fibers. And because your muscles are voracious energy hogs, each one is rigged up with its own personal nerve to stimulate contraction and its own artery and vein to keep it well fed with all the blood and oxygen and nutrients it needs to operate. So to understand those operations, we first need to get a grip on the anatomy of a skeletal muscle, which involves fibers within fibers and lots of layers. Basically, a skeletal muscle is constructed like a really sturdy piece of rope. Thousands of tiny parallel threads called myofibrils squish together to form muscle fibers, which are your actual muscle cells, cells with mitochondria, multiple nuclei, and a cellular membrane called a sarcolemma. Those muscle fibers then form larger string-like bundles called fascicles, which combine to form the larger rope-like muscle organ like your biceps brachii. Overall, this bundles of bundles configuration makes muscle tissue fairly sturdy, but considering how much abuse your muscles take when you do something like pretty simple, like lift a big bag of dog food, it's no surprise you need a little help. That's why every muscle contains a few different kinds of supportive sheaths of connective tissue, the protective reinforcements that keep that bulging muscle from bursting. So that is the structure part of the story. But if you want to get into the nitty-gritty, the down and dirty of how you actually move, well, there are rules. Really just two main rules, and they have to do with proteins. And they're both true for a lot of the proteins we talk about, whether they're enzymes or ion channels or receptors or muscle proteins. And these rules are: 1, proteins like to change shape when stuff binds to them, and 2, changing shapes can allow proteins to bind or unbind with other stuff. So keep those rules in mind while we see how a muscle fiber contracts and relaxes. Now, remember those tiny myofibrils that bundle up to form your muscle fibers? They're divided lengthwise into segments called sarcomeres, which contain 2 even tinier strands of protein, 2 different kinds of myofilaments called actin and myosin. And it's their angsty story of star-crossed love that fuels every movement your body could possibly dream of. A sarcomere contains both thin filaments made up mostly of two light and twisty actin strands, and thick filaments composed of thicker, lumpy-looking myosin strands. Each sarcomere is separated by what's known as a Z line at either end, which is just a border formed by alternating thin filaments in a kind of zigzag pattern. A muscle contracting is all about sarcomeres contracting, bringing those Z lines closer together. All right, so now comes the romance. When your muscle cells are at rest, your actin and myosin strands don't touch, but they really want to. Specifically, that club-headed myosin wants to get all up close and personal with the actin. When this happens, and it will eventually, it's called the sliding filament model of muscle contraction. But in the meantime, like in any good love story, the pair have some obstacles to overcome. Namely, actin is blocked by a couple of protein bodyguards called tropomyosin and troponin, which keep getting in the way. Luckily, these guards can be bought off with a little ATP and some calcium. I prefer cash and nachos, whatever. Remember, ATP is kind of like molecular currency. It contains chemical energy, and your muscles are all about converting chemical energy to motion, so they're always hungry for more ATP. Your muscle cells have lots of nuclei, but some of them also have a lot of mitochondria, whose sole purpose in life is to crank out ATP. And muscle cells also have their own version of an endoplasmic reticulum, the cell's transport and storage system, but in this case it's specialized, so it gets a special name, the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Its walls are loaded with calcium pumps, which use ATP to save up a bunch of calcium ions, and it's also studded with calcium channels that are linked to voltage-sensitive proteins in the membrane of the muscle cell. Say I want to move my arm. My brain sends an action potential along the motor neuron until it synapses with a muscle cell in my arm. The receptors on that muscle cell are ligand-gated sodium channels. So when the motor neuron releases our old friend acetylcholine into the synapse, the channels open up and create a rush of sodium into the cell as a graded potential, which, if it's strong enough, causes nearby voltage-gated sodium channels to open. Now, I want to take a second and point out here that we're still talking about an action potential, but not in a neuron. This is happening in a muscle cell, people. So that action potential zips along a muscle cell's membrane, the sarcolemma, which has lots of tubes that run deep inside the cell called T-tubules. When the action potential travels down one of those tubes, it eventually triggers the voltage-sensitive proteins that are linked to those calcium channels in the cell's sarcoplasmic reticulum. When those channels are thrown open, the calcium stored inside rushes into the rest of the cell, and finally myosin is like, yes, here we go. At this point, the myosin is totally stoked, because the bodyguards that have been frustrating it are in for a big, irresistible distraction. That's because the protein troponin just loves to bind with calcium. And remember, when stuff binds to proteins, the proteins change shape. So the calcium latches onto the troponin and causes it to pull the other bodyguard protein, the tropomyosin, away from the sites on the actin strands that the myosin really wants to get its paws on. And suddenly it's all, okay. But the only myosin heads that can bind to those newly exposed sites are the ones that are ready for action. That is, the ones that have already grabbed a molecule of ATP that's been floating around and broken it down into ADP and the leftover phosphates. When a myosin head does that, it moves into an extended position, kind of like a stretched spring, still holding on to the ADP and the phosphate, and still storing the energy that was released when they were broken apart. So after all that, with the myosin primed for action and the bodyguards out of the way, the myosin finally binds to actin, and it is beautiful. When they bind, the myosin releases all that stored energy, and in the excitement of it all, the myosin changes shape. It pulls on its precious actin strand, kind of like pulling a rope hand over fist. In the process, it shrinks the whole sarcomere and contracts the muscle. That's the sliding part of the sliding filament model. Now, with its energy spent, that little head has no use for the ADP and the phosphate, so they unbind with it because, remember rule number 2, changing shape encourages proteins to bind or unbind with stuff. That unbinding causes a small change in its shape, which lets a fresh ATP bind there in its place. That binding causes another shape change, but this time it causes the myosin to release from the actin in a tear-jerking scene like some microscopic recreation of the finale from Titanic. But fear not, this epic is not quite over, because this is when the myosin breaks down its new molecule of ATP into ADP and a phosphate, which moves it into the armed position yet again, getting it ready for its next rendezvous. And meanwhile, those calcium pumps are working hard to restock the calcium in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, so they start grabbing the calcium that's floating around, causing calcium to unbind from the troponin. When it unbinds, the resulting shape change puts the tropomyosin bodyguards back into place. It's a circle. Or potentially a big Hollywood franchise with Lots and lots of sequels. It keeps repeating itself many, many times every moment while I sit here and talk, and while you sit there and eat and text and take notes, the whole drama replaying itself over and over. Kind of like you'll have to play this video over and over again to get all.
Okay, so when I see that video, I'm like, whoa, that's a lot. It's really intense, I know. But it includes, like I said, pretty much everything, all those steps we talked about in the muscle contraction. So rewatch it if it's helpful to you, kind of stop it, take notes, let it sink in. And for the nervous system, I think he has a couple of videos for that. So maybe I'll share those as reviews as well. But that's it for today. No class Friday, yay. If you're in lab today, I'll see you there, but otherwise I'll see you on Monday. Have a good long weekend.